Hello, my name's Colin Campbell. You're looking at Forced Showdown from Beta Dwarf. They're a Copenhagen-based operation. The game is coming out on Windows PC on March 29th. The developers pitch it as Hearthstone meets Diablo, but I think it's probably a bit more interesting than that. I played it for a few hours this week. I got through some of the early levels. What's interesting about it is that it's a roguelike, and if you fail to get past certain checkpoints, i.e. big bosses, you know, it's tough. You've got to go all the way back to the beginning, and it's a kind of laddered system, so you have to play your way through again and again these early levels until you get to beat the big bosses and finally put them in your pocket once and for all. But you know, that sort of feels like a chore at first, but I sort of got the hang of it after a while, because obviously the levels are randomly generated up to a point. The enemies are randomly placed. The number of enemies is also random. I mean, some of these levels I cleared in literally 5 or 6 seconds, and some of them were much more difficult. Sometimes you're placed in the midst of a lot of aggressive and hostile enemies, and sometimes you've got time to wander around the map and figure out how to pick them off one by one. So, you know, it is a roguelike in the sense that you've got to get good at it in order to progress, in order to get into that groove, into that zone where you can play for long periods at a time. And during this session, after I beat the boss at the end here, I went on to beat another boss, and then I went quite a long way on in the sort of like third round, so to speak, of the game. So it is one of those things where you get into the groove and you'll get a long way, and that is helped in large part obviously by skill, but also by picking up cards. And you'll see at the start of this level I've got some cards that I've, you know, from my deck that are randomly selected for me. I've got some mana underneath. Those purple things are mana, and so, you know, there are some of them that I can't pick, there are some of them that I can. The mana runs out each round, and so your best bet is kind of to pick the ones that cost the most or that you feel the most comfortable with. You can see there that the two main powers that I have is the stick of fire that I shoot at people, and that if I keep it on somebody for long enough, you get an extra boost, and it does a serious amount of damage, and you get buffs and boosts as you go along. As you can see here, there's a local area of damage that you can use, and you can double the power of that with a card later on. There's also an ability to protect yourself. And there are various characters, and they all have their own special abilities. But the main thing is that as you pick up these powers, as you collect them along the way, they accrue. Sometimes by the time you get to these bosses, you're so powered that actually it's kind of a crime that if you lose. And I was very disappointed with myself when I did lose after this area that I'm talking to you about here. So you know, if you're not into roguelikes, there can be an element of frustration of going back and covering what sort of seems like the same ground. I spoke to the developers about this. They said, you know, that is the experience that we want, that roguelike experience of feeling really good about achieving an objective, about killing a boss. And they also mentioned that later on in the game, the levels become even more kind of random and difficult and different, so that you don't feel as if you're treading the same ground over and over again. When I wrote about this game, I guess 3 or 4 months ago, what interested me about it was the setup of the developer, Beta Dwarf. They had a game called Forced out a few years ago. It was reasonably successful, and they used that money to create Forced Showdown. But they ran out of money, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 months before the game came out. And so the developer, the boss, a guy called Stefan Kebbelgaard, he got his people together. There was 18 of them, and he said, look, we're going to have to work, you know, I've got no money to pay you, so you know, here's your options. Let's just call it a day, or please stick around and let's get this job done. And the reason why they all stuck around was because the company had always been set up as a kind of quasi-cooperative, in that everybody gets to share 50% of the revenues that come back from the game. 35% goes back into the company, and 15% goes to the various founders. So they have that 50% bonus. Now, at the time, I wrote this story and I said, look, you know, I understand that there's a potential here for exploitation. You know, I personally can't stand it when people work for nothing, especially, you know, in my own trade. But I believe that because the company had been set up this way, and because they had certain mechanisms in place that I found admirable, such as their books are open to staff. Staff can look at the financial books at any time. The bonuses are paid out according to a vote, and nobody has a bigger vote than anybody else. And even if you leave the company, you still get your bonus 12 months on. So that somebody who, and there were, I believe, a couple of people who left during this period when they weren't paying anybody, they're still going to get paid. I spoke to, and there was a lot of criticism about this. A few people went online saying what a disgrace it was, and I can understand why they would think that. But having actually looked at the facts, I thought it was possibly a tiny bit unfair. So I spoke to Stefan again a couple of weeks ago, and I said, look, have you paid your people? And he said yes. He said that in the intervening time, they'd had a couple of windfalls. They'd had a Kickstarter, which was reasonably successful. They'd had a distribution deal in China for the original Forced, and the original Forced was released on consoles and had done way better than they'd anticipated. They sort of thought that it would die a death out there in console land, and it did pretty well for them. So everybody has been paid their wages, with a couple of exceptions, like an unpaid intern and an artist who left. But both those people will still get their bonuses according to Stefan. So let's hope that this system works out for the people that work there. I think they've made a pretty good game here. I've enjoyed the 5 or 6 hours I've played of it so far. I'm going to go back and play some more, but it does open up some really interesting questions about how people go about making games in this day and age where they are expensive to make. Even if you're talking about a $20 Steam game, they can be expensive to make. But I think it's interesting that, and you can see here I'm up against the big boss. I think it's interesting that companies are trying something new, that the model of just simply I'm the boss, here's your wages, and at the end of the day you go home and you don't get anything else. It doesn't have to be the only way that people work. But I will put the caveat in that we work in an industry, the video games industry, just like the journalism industry, where people are exploited all the time and people are asked to work for nothing, which I agree is disgraceful. In this case, I believe that something else is going on. So here you can see the boss. This guy has some very predictable patterns. I didn't have that much trouble defeating him. I quite enjoy some of the shtick, some of the chit chat that these guys give you. As you can see in the game, there's also quite a lot of loot, especially health, which is so important. I mean, you can see here, this game, I'm running out of health rapidly, and it was pretty hairy on this one. And I think the next boss that I fought afterwards was also a situation where I was down to like 3% health when I finally killed it. So whenever you get that card that says health, take it, or at least save it for when you're really going to need it. This is Forced Showdown, out on March 29th.